After crown preparations, both for PFMs and all ceramic crowns or bridges, the role of the clinician is to make a perfect impression. It could be the conventional impressions, or it could also be the new digital impressions. However, certain concepts have to be cleared. Let's discuss about what are the various materials that we can use, when do you use these materials, and what are the clinical steps so that you don't make errors during the entire process of impression making and pouring. We'll also discuss about how to make provisionals, immediate provisionals, planned provisionals, all of it, and what are the different materials that we can use. Let's begin with the requirement for an impression material. The impression material has to flow very easily around each tooth to be recorded interproximally, and that's why very good flow characteristics are important for the material. When we are trying to make a tray which is going to be an overall form of the arch, a heavy viscosity material is used. While when we are trying to inject a material around specific areas and prepare teeth, we want to use a low viscosity material. We need to have adequate time for working, and we should have a rigid impression unit. That means a tray which will not distort during and after the impression, so that it supports an impression which does not tear or distort easily. We need to see that the impression material we use is very rigid, so that it prevents tearing at thin areas at the margins. We should be able to pour this impression multiple times if required. It should be dimensionally stable, and of course it should be tolerant to moisture because we are dealing with saliva, and we should have adequate shelf life. All of these things coupled together would make an ideal impression. Let's understand what is a good impression. A good impression is an exact negative replica of each prepared tooth and must also include all the prepared surfaces as well as an adequate amount of unprepared tooth structure adjacent to the margin, so that the technician can easily visualize the margin and end it there. It's important because the emergence profile of the restoration depends upon how the technician merges the restoration at the margin. This area is the thinnest area, and not only a good preparation at this area is important, but also a beautiful reflection of this area, the gingiva around this area is important to capture this unprepared area, tooth. Retraction procedures are mandatory for such high precision impressions. Let's understand. In impression techniques or materials, we have two kinds of materials. Rigid materials, which are usually used for edentulous purposes when you're trying to record bony landmarks as well as without teeth. So that's the most ideal use of a rigid material. While elastic material is used for dentulous cases where you can have two groups in that, which can be synthetic elastomeric impressions, or it could be hydrocolloids, which could again be reversible like agar agar, and irreversible, which is alginate. And in synthetic elastomeric, we will have different groups like polysulfide, polyether, silicones, which can be addition or condensation silicon. So this will be the overall classification. Whichever material you're using, you need to understand the benefits of that material and how you could manipulate those materials to minimize errors during the entire process of impression making. Let's understand comparisons between an alginate impression and condensation silicone. Both of them have to be poured very quickly. Alginate in the first 7 or 8 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, and condensation silicone in 30 minutes. Alginate has got a very, very poor dimensional stability. It has a very low tear resistance compared to silicon, condensation silicon. However, shrinkage due to loss of byproducts like ethyl alcohol is more sometimes in silicon. So your technique, you're very, very sensitive towards how you mix. Your proportioning had to be proper. You need to understand that these are the two quick ways of making impressions. However, you have to really pour these impressions immediately after you have made them. The elastomeric group impressions, and if you're comparing the most two commonly used, the polyether and the VPS material, you see that the polyether material has an elastic recovery of about 99%. So it is a very, very good material to rely upon for accuracy. It can be poured within up to 7 days without any distortion. The newer ones also have non-ionic surfactants which improve the wettability, and thus pouring it with gypsum will become easier. Incorporating voids becomes, not incorporating voids becomes easier. While when you're looking at a VPS material, we are depending upon good dimensional stability and elastic recovery of about 97%. Can be multiply poured also. Multiple pours possible, and it's thixotrophic in nature. And the newer ones actually are also relatively more hydrophilic, so you could use them also. The polyether is preferred for making impressions for implant situations and implant and teeth situations. VPS can also be used, but it's more used. It all depends upon what is available and what is convenient to you and what is the dispensing mode available in your practice. So you could use either of them, but you need to know the pluses and minuses of both. The tray recommendations are always going to be whether it is for multiple units or whether it is for single or double units. It's going to be a rigid tray or a full arch custom tray. It could be sectional tray. All of them have to be rigid, or it could be just bite trays. You have to be sure that it's also a rigid tray, because you don't want to have a plastic bite tray which is going to move, and it's of course recommended for a single unit, but generally you would like to use well supported trays for making your impressions for multiple units. It's always better to have more reliability with your impressions. Tray adhesive, a lot of people think that perforation in the tray is enough for allowing the tray to the material to get completely seated on the tray, but unfortunately, because the material is so rigid, it can easily distort. And this distortion, more than that, it can just displace itself from the base of the tray. So it's very, very important that it gets adhered properly to the tray base, so that there is no lifting of the material from the tray at any point. So the interlocking system of perforation is good for a relatively less rigid material like alginate, but when it comes to a more rigid, more stronger material, elastomeric material, you will definitely need to use an adhesive. At least 3 to 5 minutes before is recommended. So selection of your tray and putting a tray adhesive is almost important, very, very important, and almost most of the people, they usually are in a hurry and they forget to put the adhesive. So it's always important that you have to place this adhesive several minutes before you actually load the tray. So tray selection also means placing adhesives. So we come to the end of the first section. And I think it's time for a question and answer session now.